From the first whisper of a dust-choked wind, a story was already being sung across the Dakota plains, a low lament of lonesome hearts and the stark, brutal truth of the West. It wasn't a tale told in taverns, but in the quiet creak of a wagon wheel and the sigh of a man who'd seen too many suns set on an empty horizon. This was the ballad of Wyatt and Dolores, of a kind of love so fiercely forbidden it had to be earned with grit, with silence, and with the simple damning honesty of a man and a woman who had nowhere else to go. The air hung heavy and thick as a wool blanket on a summer's day, a white heat shimmering off the endless prairie. Pine Creek was just a scar in the landscape, a few weathered buildings huddled against the relentless sky. Dolores kept her head down the brim of her bonnet, a meager shade against the sun and the stairs. At 7 feet 3 inches, she was a monument of a woman, a figure too grand for the small, mean-spirited world she walked through. Her dress, pale blue and worn threadbare, clung to her frame, patched 100 times over each different shade of blue, a testament to a journey with no end. The neckline was torn and stretched a small public indecency she couldn't hide nor could she afford to mend. Her boots, stiff and too small, were a constant ache, a dull reminder of her family's final cutting words: "No man will take you. You eat too much, you take up too much space." They had sent her out to the wolves of the world, and she had been walking ever since. She held the coins in her hand, a meager ransom for a bag of flour and a pinch of coffee. It was all she had, a laugh sharp as a broken bottle sliced through the quiet. She knew without looking. A glance, and the mockery would find her eyes a small victory for the world's cruelties. Then a shadow fell, not from the sun, but from a man standing over her. Wyatt. He was a force of a man, 6'4" of hard-earned muscle, with a slow, deliberate grace to his movements. His hair, dark and untamed, was a testament to the open road, and his jaw was shadowed with the dark stubble of a man who lived by his own code. His eyes, the color of a storm-swept sky, were steady, seeing her not as a curiosity, but as a person. He crouched down, his fingers calloused and strong, pressing the errant coins into the dust before the wind could steal them away. He stood and held them out to her, his voice a low rumble. "Wind's bad for keeping change in your hand." She looked up, bracing for the usual cruelty, but there was only a quiet acknowledgement in his gaze. It was a gaze that didn't flinch, didn't drop to her chest, didn't mock her height. It just stayed. "Guess I wasn't watching close enough," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "You headed anywhere after here?" he asked. The question was simple, but in his tone, she heard an offer she had never known a man could make. She could have lied, said she was fine, said she had a place. But something in him, in the stillness of his gaze, made her tell the truth. The Miller barn. He didn't flinch, didn't frown. "That place won't keep the rain out." He paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon and back to her. "I've got a room out past the cottonwoods. Clean bed, bolt on the inside, supper most nights." Her first thought was a sharp, bitter laugh. Men didn't offer things for free. There was always a price. But there was no smirk on his face, no hungry look in his eyes. Just the offer, plain and direct, like a man offering a drink of water in a desert. She thought of the cold, hard ground of the barn, the wind cutting through the open walls, the ache in her bones, and the knot in her stomach. She thought of her father's words echoing in her mind. "All right," she said the word, feeling too small, too quiet for the immense risk she was taking. He picked up his sack of oats and gestured for her to fall in beside him. They walked, their strides in sync, leaving the town behind and the eyes of the townsfolk in their wake. They walked a path worn smooth by a million journeys, but this one was different. It was the start of something. The silence between them wasn't empty, but full of unspoken questions, the quiet hum of two people trying to read the landscape of a soul. His house was a small, square-built thing with a low porch, a haven from the endless flat prairie. A stack of cordwood stood neat and straight against the wall, a testament to a man who took pride in his work. He held the door for her, and she stepped into a world of pine soap and strong coffee, the air cool and calm. There was no clutter, just the stark, clean order of a man who lived alone and lived well. He led her to a small room at the back of the house, where a bed was covered with a folded quilt and a wash basin sat on a stand. A bolt was fixed to the inside of the door, a small, polished piece of iron that promised security. "You can lock it from in here," he said, tapping the bolt. "No one comes around." She stepped fully inside, her hand brushing the door frame. She hadn't had a door she could lock since she had left her father's house. For a moment, she couldn't speak a wave of emotion, so intense it threatened to overwhelm her. She just nodded. "I'm gone most mornings with the freight teams," he said, his voice as steady as the horizon. "Back before sundown. There's beans, flour, and coffee in the pantry. Water barrels out back." She finally looked at him, her heart thumping a desperate rhythm. "You sure about this? You don't know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "You needed a place. I had one." Her chest tightened, the plain truth of it almost too much to bear. She thought of her father's cruel words, the cold nights in the barn, the coins spinning away in the dust. She thought of how many times she had been told she was a burden. By the time she found her voice, he was already moving toward the kitchen. "You eat yet?" he asked. She shook her head. "Stew on the stove," he said. "There's enough for two." That night they ate by the soft glow of a lamp, the light a small circle of warmth in the vast darkness. He didn't push her to talk. When she did, she told him about her family, about the finality of their words, the loneliness of her journey. He listened without interruption, his steady gaze making her feel seen, not judged. When they were done, he showed her the bolt again, and she slid it into place, feeling the weight of it, the solid promise of safety. Alone in the room, she sat on the bed, her hands on her knees, the ache in her feet slowly beginning to fade. She wasn't sure how long she would stay, but for tonight she had walls, a door, and a lock. That was more than enough. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, a slow, steady pulse that beat in time with the creak of the floorboards and the low hum of the wind. She learned his habits, the way he woke before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the porch, the faint scent of coffee that would drift into her room. She learned the landscape of his quiet world, the way he moved with deliberate purpose, not slow but never rushed, the steady grace of his hands as they worked with wood and leather. She saw that he was the kind of man who built things to last, a man who believed in the strength of a foundation. He had left her with a line of credit at the mercantile, a gesture of trust that felt both immense and terrifying. The first time she walked into town alone, she felt the stares like pinpricks on her skin. Two women outside the dress shop stopped their conversation, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and contempt. She kept her chin level, a fortress of quiet dignity. The shopkeeper, a man with a weathered face, acknowledged her presence, his gaze lingering on her height before he looked away, but he wrote down her purchases without question when she gave him Wyatt's name. "Reed's a good man," he said, "keeps to himself." She returned to the house, the small parcels of flour and sugar feeling like a victory. She spent the afternoon cleaning, scrubbing the floorboards, wiping down the table. It was the first time in a long time she had cooked a meal for someone else, and it felt strange but not unpleasant. When Wyatt returned, the scent of dust and sweat clinging to him, he brought a piece of salted pork, a small offering that spoke louder than any words. He took his first bite of her stew and looked at her. "This is good." A small smile, a fragile, rare thing, touched the corner of her lips. He asked if anyone had given her trouble in town. When she said no, he studied her face, his eyes narrowing slightly. "If someone does, you tell me." The calm certainty in his voice was a shield. She believed he meant it. That night, the sound of his boots across the floor was a familiar comfort, not the sound of a threat, but the sound of a promise kept. For the first time, she didn't feel the old tired instinct to be ready to leave before sunrise. Their next trip to town was different. He asked her to come with him, a simple invitation that carried the weight of a declaration. She felt the eyes on them, the murmurs, the whispers. She saw the men on the saloon porch, their laughter sharp and mocking. "Big woman, like that you'll have to build a bigger house," one of them called out, his voice thick with a mean-spirited humor. Wyatt stopped the wagon. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he just looked at them, his gaze as steady as a rifle barrel, and his voice was a low, even command. "You'll keep your mouth shut around her." The man's smirk faltered, his laughter dying in his throat. It was a small act, but it was a quiet, powerful testament to his protectiveness. Back at the house, she found herself reinforcing her dress, stitching the new cloth to the worn fabric, and for the first time, she felt her body not as a cage but as a temple. He caught her eye, a quiet, knowing approval in his gaze. The rain came 2 days later, a cold, persistent misery that turned the road to mud. They were forced to stay inside, the sound of the rain on the roof, a constant low drum. She found herself watching him as he whittled a piece of pine, his large, capable hands working with a craftsman's precision. He was a man of few words, and she found herself wanting to know the secrets of his past. "What made you stop here?" she asked. He set the knife down. "Work was steady. House came up for sale. Figured I could fix it up. No family left not close by. Brother raised me after our folks passed. He's gone now." The words were simple, but in the shift of his jaw, she saw the ghost of a pain he kept locked away. She wanted to tell him about her own past, the sudden, sharp betrayal of her father's words, the silence of her mother. But the words were a raw thing in her throat. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or awkward, but full of a quiet understanding. Then he said something that stopped her heart. "You've been carrying yourself like you're waiting for someone to knock on the door and tell you to go." His words were a mirror, reflecting her deepest, most hidden fear. "That's because it's happened before," she whispered. "Not here," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "You've got a room, food, work if you want it. That's not going to change." The words settled over her, a blanket of security she had never known. She wanted to believe him. The spoon he handed her later, carved from a single piece of pine, was a small, unspoken promise. It wasn't just a utensil. It was a statement. He saw her here, he saw her staying, and when she went to her room that night, she slid the bolt across the door, but for the first time, it was a habit, not a necessity. The sound of his boots was a steady, familiar lullaby. For the first time, she thought she might not be just passing through. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the land soft and fragrant. The air was heavy with the promise of new life. Dolores was working in the kitchen, and Wyatt was outside mending a section of fence. The day passed in a comfortable rhythm, a dance of two people moving in separate orbits, but always within each other's gravity. When he came inside, his shirt damp with sweat and his hands smelling of cedar, she was ladling stew into two bowls. The air between them had a new charge, a crackle of unspoken tension. His gaze lingered on her a fraction of a second longer. The pauses in his speech stretched. He lingered at the table after supper, and she felt the unspoken question hanging in the air. "You've been here near 2 weeks now," he said, his voice low. "Feels longer," she replied, her own voice steady. "Not in a bad way." He took a step closer, close enough for her to see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "You've been carrying your guard high," he said. "I understand why, but I want you to know I'm not waiting for you to leave." Her pulse quickened. She had heard a lifetime of hollow promises from men who wanted something from her. But in his voice there was only truth, a raw, unflinching honesty. "Why?" she asked, the word a small, desperate breath. "Because I like having you here," he said, the words simple and direct. "Because you make the place better." Her breath caught in her throat. She stood still as he reached up his hand, slow and deliberate, and touched her cheek. His calloused palm was warm against her skin, and she didn't move away. They stayed like that for a long moment, the silence filled with the weight of all they hadn't said. Then he lowered his head, and she met him halfway, their lips brushing in a slow, steady kiss that was more of an agreement than a question. His hand rested at her waist, a firm, grounding presence. She found herself leaning into him, feeling the solid weight of him, the reality of his presence. When they parted, neither spoke. He just moved toward the stove to bank the fire, and she stood at the table, her hand on the edge, the warmth of his touch a brand on her skin. That night in her room, she slid the bolt across the door, but it was a familiar motion, a simple closing of a door, not a defense. The sound of his boots in the next room was a comfort, a promise. She went to bed without feeling the old familiar ache of loneliness. She was home. The days that followed passed in a quieter rhythm, but it was a rhythm of two hearts beating in unison. The silence was not empty, but full of unspoken moments, the way he lingered at the table after supper, the way her hand found his when they passed each other in the narrow hallway. 3 weeks later, she found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the calendar, her stomach a tight knot of disbelief. She counted the days twice, then a third time, the numbers coming up with the same impossible answer. She was late. All her life she had been told her size made her less, that she was not breeding material. Her father's words echoed in her ears, a familiar torment, and yet she felt the nervous heat rising in her chest. She carried the knowledge alone for a day, unsure of how to tell him, terrified of the answer. When he came in from hauling freight, his shirt damp with sweat and dust, he noticed her quietness instantly. "Something on your mind?" he asked. She hesitated, her spoon hovering over the stew. "I might be expecting." His hand stilled on the table. For a second his expression was unreadable. Then his shoulders relaxed, and he leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You think so?" "I'm late," she said plainly. More than a little. He nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. If you are, we'll be ready for it. If you're not, we still are what we are now. The calm certainty in his voice was a balm to her frayed nerves. She had braced herself for doubt, for questions, for 100 ways he might try to push her away. Instead, he spoke as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Don't you mind, she asked, her voice small. I told you I wanted you here, he said. That doesn't change because we might have a child. Relief washed over her, a slow, gentle tide. She hadn't realized how much of her had been waiting for a different answer. The next morning, she walked to the midwife's house, and the woman, sharp-eyed and gentle, confirmed her suspicions. Your body is doing just what it should, she said. When Dolores returned, Wyatt was mending a harness on the porch. She told him what the midwife had said, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw him smile, with his eyes a deep, genuine happiness that reached all the way to his soul. That night, as they sat at the table, the lamp between them, she looked around the house and saw it not as a place she was borrowing, but as the beginning of a life that was finally her own. The next week, Wyatt announced he was heading to town for supplies. Want to ride along? He asked, his voice casual, but she knew the invitation was a test of sorts. A declaration. She agreed, ready to face the world with him at her side. The morning was crisp, the wagon wheels crunching over the hard-packed dirt. They reached Main Street, and the usual eyes followed them. Wyatt stopped at the Mercantile, and she went inside, picking out flour, coffee, and a spool of thread. When they came back out, two men lounged on the saloon porch. Is that the big one you've been keeping out there? One of them called, a cruel grin on his face. Heard you've got her working for her keep. Dolores froze, the words stinging. She had heard worse, but to hear it with Wyatt there, to hear her worth reduced to labor, it was a new kind of pain. She started to walk on, but Wyatt stopped in his tracks, turning to face them. His voice was low, but it cut through the air hard and clear. She's not working for her keep. She's my wife. The words were a hammer blow. Dolores's breath caught in her throat. The men's smirks vanished. Wyatt didn't wait for a response. He took her hand, his grip firm, and started walking toward the small church at the end of the street. We're making it official, he said quietly. Inside, the preacher looked surprised but didn't ask questions. They stood before the altar, with only the preacher's wife as witness, and spoke the simple vows. Wyatt slid a plain gold band onto her finger. It wasn't fancy, but it was real, and it was hers. When they stepped back outside into the afternoon sun, he kissed her on the steps, his hands firm at her waist. It was a kiss of ownership, a declaration to the world, to anyone still watching, that she was his. There was no shame in it. There was only a quiet, fierce pride. That evening back at the house, she stood at the washstand and looked at herself in the small mirror. The gold band glinted in the lamplight. For years she had been told she was too big, too much, not enough. And yet she was here, a wife. Wyatt came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. You all right? He asked. She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. More than all right. He kissed the top of her head, his warmth grounding her. She knew the talk would continue in Pine Creek, but it no longer mattered. The paper was signed, the vows were spoken, and the man standing behind her had claimed her for the world to see. Winter came early that year, a shroud of frost over the land. Dolores's pregnancy was no longer a secret, but a quiet, steady presence. Wyatt had built a cradle from pine, his hands smoothing every edge, a labor of love. She had sewn small clothes, each stitch a prayer for the life growing within her. When the labor started, it was just after midnight, the air sharp with cold. She woke with a tightening in her belly, a pain more profound than any she had ever known. Wyatt was up instantly, a pillar of calm in the dark, stoking the fire, sending for the midwife. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and breath, of her hands gripping the edge of the bed, and his hands steady and strong holding her shoulder. He didn't fill the room with useless words, but with his presence, his quiet strength. The midwife, a woman of calm precision, guided her through each contraction until finally a sharp, piercing cry filled the room, a sound that broke the tension like a glass shattering. The midwife laid a small, squirming baby girl against her chest. Dolores let out a long, shuddering breath, a tear sliding into her hair as she looked down at the tiny, perfect face. Wyatt stood over them, his eyes fixed on the child, and when the baby's small fist curled around his finger, his jaw tightened, and she saw the glisten of tears in his eyes. She's perfect, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. They named her Ruth, after his mother, a name that carried the weight of a quiet, strong woman. The days after Ruth's birth settled into a new rhythm, a quiet and joyful melody. Wyatt took over the heavy chores, a silent declaration that her job was to rest and heal. Neighbors who had once stared came by with bread and stew, their curiosity softening into acceptance when they saw the new mother and her child. By early spring, the yard was green again. Wyatt had planted a row of beans, a sign of a future he believed in, a testament to a life he was building. Dolores stood on the porch with Ruth in her arms, watching him work, and a steady warmth filled her. A home, a husband who had chosen her without hesitation, and a daughter who had proven every cruel word she had ever been told wrong. That evening, after Ruth was settled in the cradle, Wyatt pulled her into his arms by the fire. He kissed her slow and sure, just as he had that first time, and when he parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "We've got everything we need right here," he said, his voice a low rumble. Dolores smiled, her hand on his cheek. "And we're keeping it." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, but inside the house, the air was warm and still. Their little family was complete. The past was a fading echo. Pine Creek could talk all it wanted. This was their home, and they had built it to last.